Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Amya Kumar Das, associated with the Department of Sociology, Tejpur University. Today, in this session, we are going to discuss on endogenous knowledge as developed by Paulin Hountondji. Paulin Hountondji developed the concept or the idea of endogenous knowledge in an interactive seminar organized by him. This concept tries to look at the knowledge system exploited by the Western countries. Many of us, we have seen from previous examples in other sessions and other modules that how the knowledge system is dominated by the Northern academics. In this context, Paulin Hountondji, while offering this idea, he contextualized it in the larger historical context. He says the dependency factor on Northern countries has happened not only in terms of economic realm but in the realm of knowledge production as well. Even after various countries got independence, the dependence on knowledge domain still continued. He criticized the whole idea of this dependency factor on the North or on the Western countries. He says this domination has ruined the knowledge system. Thereby, he tries to develop the idea of endogenous knowledge system. So here, he would like to analyze what is endogenous knowledge system and how it works, how it can offer a critique to the existing knowledge system which is produced by the Western countries. According to Hountondji, the knowledge system in African context is highly dependent on the northern countries. The Western countries were controlling the knowledge production in many parts of the world, including Africa. That is what he is discussing in his context or in his concept developed in the form of endogenous knowledge. Who is Paulin Hountondji? Paulin Hountondji is a contemporary Beninese philosopher and the director of the African Center for Advanced Studies. He is also the professor of philosophy at the Université du Benin, Cotonou. Hountondji was also an active politician, a critic of Benin's military dictatorship, and a prominent personality who was involved in the process of Benin's democratic return. Hountondji's work are important to understand the academic dependency of Africa to the north. Hountondji believed that the underdevelopment of Africa needs to be understood through a historical approach and not through a evolutionist approach. Evolutionist approach understands this underdevelopment as inevitable, whereas historical approach enlightens us to the aspect of colonial exploitation of Africa in the past. He argues that the knowledge production in Africa is still externally oriented to cater the needs of Northern University. Hountondji argues this through the concept of extraversion and endogenous knowledge. Though Hountondji substantiates his arguments with the present situation of African economy and academia, his academic contributions are relevant in the context of all post-colonial nations. Hountondji continues his argument with the examples from this dependency theory. He says that even though nations and countries got independence from this colonial rule, they are still continuing in the form of economy and knowledge production. Like the mother country, they still exploit the colonized countries in the form of economic domination and consumption-oriented economy. What does it mean? We have seen from this dependency analysis that in many Latin American and African countries, the Western countries still have their interest in the form of exploitation, in the form of economy, like they are dependent on these third world countries, developing nations for raw materials and to find out a new market. They create a market which will suit to their own interest rather than the interest of the third world countries. Similarly, Hountondji argues, bringing parallel with this economic exploitative relationship, he says it is similar in the case of knowledge production as well. If we look at this relationship between the knowledge production in the periphery and in the Western countries, we can still see that these African nations are made and they are given territory in the form of knowledge production which will suit these Western countries. So this kind of exploitative relationship still happening both in the domain of economy and in the domain of knowledge productions. Paulin Hountondji tries to show this exploitative relationship through his analytical arguments. As we have seen that knowledge production should be independent and autonomous or from any other exploitative relationships or hegemony or dominance. But here to serve their own interest, how these European nations and countries, they have been exploiting the other parts of the world like African nations, Latin American nations, South Asian nations in this exploitative domination and relationship. To analyze this, Hountondji gives mostly two forms of explanation. One is, he says that this kind of exploitative relationship and the underdevelopment of the underdeveloped nation happens mainly in two ways. One, in the same way the colonies acted as a sources of raw materials for the industries of mother country, the research in the third world is merely performing the job of providing informations or data as intellectual raw materials to the universities and laboratories of the North. Secondly, the theories produced in the North are imported to Africa. African academia, according to Hountondji, also serve as loyal consumers for the theories produced in the North. What happened here? He is giving these two kinds of example exactly in the same way that a dependency theory happened. In the world system theory or the dependency theory as developed in the Latin American context, what we have seen, there is a chain kind of relationship, semi-periphery, periphery and core. So core is the main exploitative center. Then we have semi-periphery, which is a connecting link between periphery and core. And even in the dependency theory, we have seen how this core and periphery, or the center and periphery, the metropolis and satellite, these countries, the different geographical zones are connected through an exploitative relationship. Raw materials, they go to the core, raw materials travel from periphery to the core, and then they again come back with a finished product, whereby the people from periphery, they have to buy back their surplus. They have to take back their own product in a finished format, which they have to pay more. This can be seen as a very obscene exploitative relationship. Similarly, Hountondji says the raw materials of knowledge that travel from Africa to the Western countries and that is prepared in a finished product in the form of theories, and that when come back to the African nations, then the people, the academicians, the researchers, the intellectuals of these countries, these African countries, they are the main consumer of those ideas and theory. So in this exploitative relationship, it is linked to each other in such a way that it is very difficult to come out of this dependency syndrome. So here in this context, Hountondji is trying to argue that, look, we need to break this relationship, this strong bonding which these African nations and countries are dependent on the Western countries in the form of knowledge production. Hountondji argues that this raw material in the form of knowledge which has been exported to these Western countries by the African intellectuals and then developed as a part of theory in the Western countries is having a problem. What kind of problem it is having? When they developed a theory, they are not sensible enough to understand or to sense the realities or social processes which are happening in the African nations or African countries. So, with the help of these raw materials, what they develop the kind of theory for this consumption in the third world countries or elsewhere are devoid of any kind of sensibility. So, here what he says that in this context, developing any kind of theoretical perspective with the help of transported data or imported data will not give you the real feeling of the periphery or so-called third world. In this context, Hountondji also says that during when this theoretical perspective come to the African nations or third world countries, these are the consumers who think that these are apt and real for them to use. Because as we have seen, there are absence in the mostly in the colonization time. We have seen in the post-colonial era, there were critics and social scientists and social theorists. They started developing criticism and developing their own theoretical paradigms in response to the Western countries, which hegemonized them for a longer period of time. But till then, there was a huge shortage, in the sense the scarcity of conceptual and theoretical tool in the African nations and other so-called third world countries to understand the social processes and social realities. So, there the researcher and academicians, they thought it is apt to use the theoretical models and perspective that is imported from the Western countries to understand their social realities. But here, Paulin Hountondji argues against this position and says that how endogenous knowledge can be an answer to all the problems that is created by this dependency syndrome of knowledge. Hountondji offered a strong critique to the ethnophilosophy. While looking at this endogenous knowledge, it is pertinent for us to look at his position on ethnophilosophy. He says, while these researchers or the centers in the northern part, they considered Africa as an object of study, rather looking at the society as the constituent of people. So, it was not a kind of research which would consider the society as having life per se and looking their reality, considering their human values. Instead, it considers these African nations or country or social reality as an object. That is why this kind of history or sociology which were generated in the context of Africa by the researchers from the north, he says this ethnohistory or ethnosociology is Eurocentric, which is devoid of any real social processes which is part of the African nation. At the same time, he also critiqued this ethno-philosophy as saying that this ethno-philosophy, ethno-sociology, ethno-history, these are Eurocentric in its origin and its practice. Like giving example from the Temple's work, where Temple suggests that African nations didn't develop any form of structured or systematic form of philosophy. They had various kind of philosophical knowledge, but it is not consciously developed by them. It is they were unconscious of their philosophical knowledge and the practices. It was developed later when only the outsider came to the African nations and African countries, then a systematic African philosophy was developed. This is what Temple's position, and Hountondji is very critical about all sorts of ethno practices in terms of ethno-history, ethno-sociology, and ethno-philosophy in particular. Hountondji understands philosophy as a set of texts. This challenges the notion of self-unconscious existence of diverse knowledge in the African systems of thought. Searching philosophy in the oral culture of the so-called exotic primitive lands is the result of a prejudiced assumption that African people are incapable of engaging in intellectual activities such as doing philosophy. The North searches for unconscious existence knowledge in the third world. For Hountondji, African philosophy is simply the philosophy done by Africans. African philosophy is rich and unique with its particular worldviews, which will be different but no less important compared to the philosophy of the North. Hountondji is very critical about the notion and this form of argument which is developed by the North that these so-called African nations or the people in the Africa, they are not capable of developing their own theoretical perspective or own philosophy. As we have seen in the whole process of discrimination and exploitation and capturing the other parts of the world by the Europeans and Americans is based on one principle of superiority. They always thought that whites are more superior than the other blacks, browns, and other nations. So here they think that they can actually control and capture the other world through their various scientific advancement, reasoning, logic, and rationality, which were part of this modernist agenda and project. Thereby, they undermined the value and ability of other people. Here in this context, Hountondji says that this notion of undermining this value and knowledge of other people is the part of this European hegemonic agenda. So in this context, he says that this African philosophy is a philosophy, according to Hountondji, which is developed by African people. The African worldview is different from the Western worldview. If you look at from various examples, writings, and context in African nations, they give more importance to the community or the social life for the greater good. Whereas, after this advent of this Enlightenment philosophy, the modernity, rationality become foremost important feature of this modernist agenda along with freedom. These two aspects takes a different form in case of human's life and the essence of human being, that individualism became more important. Whereas in the modernist project, individualism is important. In this context, if you look at various kind of traditional societies or so-called pre-modern societies, in the context of Africa, the collectivism or the collectivity or community life is much important. So in this context, automatically the worldviews will be different in two different contexts. So how can we bring in the whole idea of worldviews or knowledge production from a place where individual position is more important than the community life in a place where community life is foremost important than the individual life? Since if we have two forms of worldviews, and when it comes to generate knowledge in others' place, it might distrust, it might create like a kind of confusion while projecting the worldviews of the others. So, while explaining the concept on extraversion, Hountondji asks many pertinent questions. These are: where does all the equipment used for research in periphery come from? How are research topics selected? Where and how are the data produced, dispatched, stored, and capitalized? How do they get translated into practical applications? On what social needs and practical requirements are they based directly or indirectly? Who are the intended beneficiaries of the research? What complex ties link our research establishments to industry in particular and the business world in general? How does it fit into the society producing it? And to what extent is this society able to take charge of its findings? While discussing the hegemony of North in the knowledge production process of Africa, again, Hountondji tries to differentiate between the qualitative as well as quantitative nature of research done in Africa and research done in North. He says that through a concept called extraversion, the southern academia is a territory under the continuing domination of North to collect raw materials, both economic and intellectual. It also acts as a market for the finished goods and theories. In this way, he argues that knowledge production in Africa is extraverted. This extraverted is related to extraversion, what we discussed just before, which means that this knowledge production is outward, externally oriented. We have to be careful and underscore this concept, that is extraversion. The importance here is given to this outward or externally oriented. It is outward oriented in the sense that its research strategies are decided by the North in direct as well as indirect ways. This outward focus of research reproduces and reinforces the hegemony of the North over the South. Hountondji argues that the African continent is having an absence of theoretical framework. This is the reason where these African countries are dependent on the North. Like in economic domain, the dependency theory suggests that how they are dependent for the capitalist development on the West. Here in the intellectual domain, the same thing is happening according to Hountondji, and they are depending on the Western countries. So as there is no proper theoretical framework development happening in the African nations, or the absence of infrastructure, the African nations are dependent on the North. So all the form of theoretical framework which is being developed by the North, which is relevant, they claim it and show it and demonstrate it in such a form that it is relevant to the African nations. But in reality, it is not. So in that extraversion or extraversion notion, Hountondji is trying to show that how even this consumption of this knowledge or theory produced in the North by the Africans are not real in a sense. These are superficial kind of theory which are being used in the Africa, because it is developed by the northern academicians, not keeping in mind the realities of the people of the Africa. So the In this context, he argues that all the academicians, they practice a kind of intellectual culture here in Africa are outward in nature. They are not internal in nature because their theoretical dependence on the North creates this situation where they are externally dependent and their research orientation and research work, research practices are not addressing the issues of these particular nations. Rather than they are being imported from the North and they are trying to use it in the local context, which is not giving a proper picture of their social reality. So, to again define and understand endogenous knowledge, we can say that it is discussed in the context of intellectual extraversion of Africa, which was developed by Hountondji as a parallel process of its economic extraversion. The intellectual extraversion can be understood as a characteristic feature of the extraverted economies. The beginning of all these exploitations can be historically traced back to the period of settler colonialism. Colonial ways of thinking, modern science, mindsets, and perspective of modernity conquered the landscapes and culture of the so-called primitive colonies. So, if we look at the question of consciousness about the necessity of revival, African traditions of knowledge are rich and diverse. They have been pushed off to the margins by the hegemony of modern knowledge systems. The African tradition of knowledge have still survived, and this survival is strong enough to the extent that even the modern African knowledge system can revive itself in a more better fashion way. So, the traditional knowledge always understood as a system of knowledge which has nothing to exchange with the true processes of knowledge production. Traditional gives meaning something which is old and fixed. When the word traditional is used, then it invokes an idea of as opposed to the modern. But we have seen that in various aspects that modern knowledge has also failed. Hountondji notes that this has led to the development of attempt towards valorization of this system of knowledge. The North has understood and studied this system to add information about their knowledge on the exotic world of the primitive. So, what is the difference between indigenous knowledge and endogenous knowledge? Endogenous knowledge is something which doesn't intend to deny the cultural transactions occurred over centuries between various cultures, but at the same time, it intends to question the structural imbalance in the power relations between North and South. Modern science has become an integral part of all the former colonies, but the term endogenous recognizes the domination and hegemony in the exchange of knowledge between North and South. But if we look at this indigenous knowledge system, it is mostly referred to the local knowledge system where it is not the same as the old, but some knowledge which is relevant in the particular context or the local context, which is not only true in the past, but even it is relevant in the present system. So, after discussing all these aspects, if we look at in this discussion on endogenous knowledge, to summarize, we can say that endogenous knowledge as developed by Paulin Hountondji is a major critique to the Western domination of knowledge. He said throughout his argument that how there is a parallel between economic dependence and intellectual dependence of the African nation on the West. They are devoid of raw materials. So they take intellectual raw materials from the African nations and develop in their intellectual environment, intellectual laboratories of the North, and again they send back that theoretical finished product to the African nations to be consumed by the researcher and academician of the African nations. Whereas it creates a huge difference of knowledge production in the north and in the south. Giving this idea or the concept of extraversion, he says the various kind of knowledge which are produced in the African context are influenced and dependent on the north. So they are not addressing to the real social processes or social realities of the local. Rather, it is outward, extravert. So they cannot address the issue which are peculiar or specific to the local areas or these African nations. So making parallel analogy or parallel comparison between this economy and intellectual domain, Hountondji strongly argues for a different kind of knowledge practices which can counter this northern hegemony of knowledge production system. He is very critical, as we have seen, about the ethnophilosophy. But other critics also have criticized Hountondji about his position on ethnophilosophy and not able to distinctively taking out various points clearly on why he has not offered any systematic criticism to this ethnophilosophy. For him, ethnophilosophy is a kind of system where outsiders have come to show Africa that this is the kind of philosophy which was developed in the African context. But he goes beyond that and says that without this discovery of philosophy by the outsider, there were philosophical practices in the African nation. So he is critical about the ethnophilosophy, he is critical about ethnohistory, he is also critical about ethnosociology. So we have seen in this discussion how Paulin Hountondji, through his concept of endogenous knowledge and extraversion, has given and offered a strong critique to the Western form of knowledge production, hegemony and domination. So for more information, please log on to the EPG Pathshala website for other readings and references. Thank you.